I met 55 or 60 through hikers, including a half a dozen or so men in their 50s and 60s. One old man, Pa Bert, was on his third through hike. I only met one older woman who appeared to be in her 60s. She hoped I might become the love of her life, but that's another story. Otherwise, the oldest women I met were Red Feather, who was 43, Mother Nature, who appeared to be a few years older, and Cashmere, who was in her 50s. Red Feather's real name is Clara Hughes, a 6-time Olympic medalist in cycling and speed skating. She last competed in London in 2012. At the age of 39, she finished 5th in the world in cycling. And could she hike? Oh my. Cashmere, a college professor from Georgia who taught organic chemistry, was a flip-flopper. That's a good thing. The Conservancy is urging hikers to start in the middle and hike north or south, and then hike the rest of the trail. Cashmere was trying to hike the entire trail in 100 days, an average of almost 22 miles a day, so she could return to her classroom on time. I can't begin to tell you how difficult it would be to average 22 miles a day. Hiking 22 miles and averaging 22 miles are two very different things. I also met a number of section hikers. Some of them are young, like California, a 26-year-old emergency medical technician from, well, you guessed it, California. But most were older white men in their 50s and 60s. In early April, I hiked for 10 days with California. We climbed a lot of mountains together in all sorts of weather, and when I commented, whined, about the steepness or length of the climb or the wind or rain, California would always say, "It's all good, Lucky." One day in April, we got an early start on what turned out to be an easy trail. And by mid-afternoon, we'd hiked 17.2 miles to a shelter where we intended to spend the night. But it was too early to knock off work, I admit that, but isn't 17.2 enough for one day? California was talking to some other section hikers while I went for water, and when I got back, he had decided to hike another 6.5 miles to a place called Trent's Grocery where he could get something to eat. Did I want to go? I did. On the way, California told me, "I guess you know you're an AT hiker when you're willing to walk 6.5 miles for a hamburger." For the first 3 weeks, I had very little appetite, and I lost almost a pound a day. If I had kept on losing like that, by the time I got to Maine, my backpack would have weighed more than I did. But after the first few weeks, I was always hungry. We all were. One of the best things I like about hiking the Appalachian Trail is that you could eat as much as you wanted of anything that you could get your hands on and still not gain weight. Through hikers burn up to 6,000 calories a day, according to the Conservancy. We couldn't carry that much food. We couldn't carry enough calories, but brother, sister, we tried to make up for it when we got to town. After one big breakfast at a restaurant, I had a banana split. On another occasion, I had breakfast at an eat-all-you-can place right beside the trail at Pinkham Notch in New Hampshire. I ate 2 scrambled eggs, 2 servings of hash browns, a blueberry muffin, a sausage patty, 10 pieces of bacon, 2 glasses of orange juice, 2 glasses of apple juice, a bowl of fruit, and 3 cups of coffee. Oh, and 4 pancakes. On the trail, I didn't fare so well. On July 7th, the day I hiked into Munson, which is the last town before the end, I was down to 1 piece of hard candy. I got up at 4 a.m. that day, packed, and was on the move by 4:50. I arrived at Main 15, which is the Munson trailhead, at 1:30 after hiking 17.9 miles. Besides the hard piece of candy, which I'd eaten for breakfast, I had traded a Sobo, a southbound hiker, a dozen water purification pills for 3 small packs of nuts. They were delicious. By the way, 4:50 a.m. was not the earliest I started hiking. Back in March, I hiked for 9 days with a fellow named Jay, a retired fire captain from Georgia. He liked to get up early and was generally having coffee by 4:30 a.m. I normally got up at 5 and we were on the move at 6 or 6:30. On one cold, snowy night, we stayed at a shelter about 2 days south of Damascus, Virginia, which is a great trail town, by the way. Jay and I slept parallel to the back wall of the shelter and still got snowed on. That's how strong the wind was that night. Anyway, we had agreed to skip breakfast and get going by 6 or 6:15. We'd use our headlamps until it got light, which was around 7. Next morning, Jay called out in the dark, "Lucky, is it time?" I asked, and he said, "Yep." So I got up, dressed, and packed as quickly as I could. It was still snowing and cold. Just as we were leaving, Jay said his watch was put away, and he asked me to check the time. It was 4:20 a.m. He looked so sorry about it, like he didn't mean it, but I told him to sell that somewhere else. Now about that love of my life thing. California had skipped part of the trail and was ahead of me at that time. As a section hiker, he could do that. Well, he was hiking with the Vikings when they ran into a young woman in her 60s. They knew I was not far behind and that she would see me soon. I was hiking north, she was hiking south, and they told her about me, what a fine fella I am. In the process, they completely oversold me, and they left out one salient fact. I'm married. I first heard about this lady from a southbound hiker who came into the shelter where I was staying, and he said, "Are you lucky?" And I said I was, and he said, "There's a woman, a Sobo, who wants to meet you." He said the Vikings in California had told her all about me, and that I'd meet her the next day because she wasn't far behind him. I did meet her. She had a pretty smile. We talked a few minutes. I don't remember how it came up, but when I mentioned something about my wife, she said, "You're married?" Anyway, I hiked on to the next shelter, Matt's Creek, and took a break there, and I checked the register. There are registers in all these shelters where hikers write notes to one another. There, to my surprise, I found this lady had written that she might meet the love of her life tomorrow. And she ended by asking, "Are you the love of my life, Lucky?" I responded in the journal, "Alas, I am not. I married the love of my life 51 years ago." The Vikings in California had not put her up to the love of my life thing, but they had commended me to her, and they thought the whole thing was pretty funny. Weeks later, I was hiking alone, and the Vikings were a few hours ahead of me, when I came across a woman who was young enough to be my granddaughter. She had pitched her tent near the trail, and when I came by, she said, "Are you lucky?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she smiled and she asked, "Are you the love of my life?" Obviously, she had met the Vikings. Almost every trail hiker I met had a trail name, as did most section hikers. A few waited to get their name more or less assigned to them based on some incident on the trail. But that strategy was fraught with peril. You could fall in mud and get a name like Dirty Bottom. So most hikers picked their own name. When I decided to hike to Maine, several friends told me how fortunate I was to have the help to at least try, and a wife who said yes. But fortunate didn't resonate with me, and lucky did. Here are some of my favorite trail names and their origin. Temper. She was not a big woman. I bet she didn't weigh 100 pounds, but when I first met her, I figured it was best to avoid any disagreement. You just know with a name like that, she must have a short fuse. But it turns out her name had nothing to do with anger management or lack thereof, and everything to do with an unusual job. She had worked in a chocolate factory where she had tempered chocolate. Tadpole planned to join the Navy after his hike with the goal of becoming a SEAL, a modern-day frogman. And as you know, a tadpole is a baby frog. 0311 got out of the Marines last summer. His MOS, military occupational specialty, was 0311, infantry. Cashmere said she sweated a lot. Get it? Sweater? Cashmere? Verminator told me that mice had eaten holes in his backpack, and he was determined to trap and kill as many of them as he could. I met a fella whose first day on the trail, it was his first day on the trail. He wasn't going anywhere special. He wasn't a northbound or southbound hiker. He was just out trying out of his equipment. And someone asked him, "Do you have a trail name?" And he replied, "Not yet," which, of course, became his trail name. I walked 1,000 miles to get ready for my hike. Actually, it was 1,000.7 miles, but who was counting? Getting in shape was the smartest thing I did. And the dumbest thing? In the beginning, I had little or no respect for bad weather. But day 2 of my hike taught me a thing or two and reminded me of one of my family's rules. If you're going to be dumb, you've got to be tough. Here's the truth of the matter. Extreme cold or high wind or rain is unpleasant. But any two of them together are dangerous and potentially fatal. And if you encounter all three at the same time, cold, wind, wet, well, you better be fully prepared or have your life insurance paid up. On the morning of February 15th, when I got out of Brother Dave's car, he took me to Springer and came to get me in Maine when I finished. When I got out of the car and began climbing Springer Mountain to begin my hike, it was 8 degrees, cold but beautiful. The next day was gray, overcast, and ominous. A storm was rolling in and there was a lot of wind. Off and on, it rained or sleeted all day. I had planned to hike to Neal's Gap to a hostel there called Mountain Crossings, but Blood Mountain, which I had to cross at the end of the day, was in my way, and I'd been there before on a section hike, and I had a healthy respect for it. It was the highest point on the AT in Georgia. And it was steep, too, particularly on the north side with a long series of slick rocks. So I decided to spend the night at Woods Hole Shelter, well short of my goal. Better safe than sorry. But when I got to Woods Hole at 4 p.m., I didn't stay. I felt good, the weather wasn't bothering me, and so I moved on, right on up Blood Mountain. It was easier than I thought it was going to be. And I could stay at the shelter on top. There is a shelter, so I'd stay there. But the Blood Mountain shelter, which is made of stone, was cold and dark and dank, and there wasn't anybody there. And at the bottom of the mountain, 2.4 miles away, there was warm food, a hot shower, and other hikers. It was already 6 p.m., almost dark, but I decided to keep going. It was a decision I would soon regret. The northbound descent from Blood Mountain is a series of long, flat rocks tied together with short pieces of trail. And on this night, the rocks were covered with ice. So all I could do finally was sit down and slide. Twice I careened out of control, bouncing off whatever got in the way. I hurt one of my knees, but I could still walk. When I finally came to a stop at the bottom, I couldn't find a trail. And believe me, it was not from lack of trying. There was no going back. My only choice was to bushwhack my way down the mountain until I found the trail. So I held my cap light I was wearing. I had a toboggan on. This is the cap light. Got it backwards. I put it in my mouth like this and started down the trail. Not the trail, through the woods. I had to keep my hands free so that I could use my poles. It was 7 o'clock, dark, wet, cold, and getting colder when I finally found the trail. I turned to my left, hiked down the mountain for a half an hour or more, until in the dim light I saw a blue blaze. The AT is marked with white blazes. The blue blazes mark side trails or other trails. I had stumbled on something called the Freeman Trail, which intersects the AT somewhere on the north slope of Blood Mountain. But where? Down or back up? I hiked down at first and then retraced myself and hiked up. I couldn't find it. At 8:30, I decided to call it a day. I had been hiking for more than 12 hours on 2 Pop-Tarts I had eaten for breakfast. I did not eat any lunch or supper. Now I had to find a spot on this trail wide enough to pitch my tent. And I did, on a 4 by 8 foot sheet of ice. I unstrapped my pack, and at that moment, my cap light battery died. It's hard to appreciate total darkness because we so rarely experience it. There's always a little light somewhere, if only from the digital face of a clock. When my cap light died on Blood Mountain, it was like standing in a closet at night with the door shut and a blindfold on. It was dark. I dug in my pocket for a cigarette lighter, but I had allowed the flint to get wet. It wouldn't light. That's when I told myself, you make one more mistake and you're not going to Maine. I had a spare light in my tool bag. Now, if I could just find it in the dark and coax my frozen fingers to make fire, I did find it. And finally, I did make fire. With the light from that lighter, I found fresh batteries for my cap light. And with the light, I was able to set up my tent. In a few minutes, I was snug inside in a sleeping bag. Outside my little house, it was sleeting. Did I pray that night on the side of Blood Mountain? Oh, yes, without ceasing. And then I slept soundly. There was a light coming through my tent when I woke up the next morning. It was 6:40, and I had one thing on my mind: time to move, time to get off Blood Mountain. My tent was frozen to the ground cover, and my ground cover was frozen to the ice. My tent frame was frozen together, so I couldn't take it apart until I huffed on each section and pulled. Worst of all, I had left my wet mittens outside, and they were frozen. I should have slept with them. The mittens were a problem. Unprotected in that kind of weather, fingers stopped working in a few minutes. I just couldn't put my hands in my jacket pocket because I needed them to hold the poles, but I couldn't walk on ice without my poles. So I stuck the frozen mittens under my shirt next to my belly so the ice would melt. My plan was to walk down the Freedom Trail until I found the AT or I found civilization. No more turning back. I jammed my frozen gear into my backpack and headed down the mountain. 2 hours later, there it was, a beautiful white blaze. I had intersected the AT. In another 45 minutes, I could see the roof of mountain crossing hostels through the bare, icy trees. I stayed at the hostel the rest of that day and 2 more days. There were 7 other thru hikers there, all hiding from a terrific winter storm in 0-degree weather. I was glad to be in stores, but it was not the toasty refuge that I had imagined it would be. It was cold inside. How cold? Well, I wore a toboggan in the shower. Okay, I made that up. How about this? The water in the dog's bowl froze, and no, it wasn't on the porch. The bowl was sitting on the living room floor, and I didn't make that up. That was not the end of my problems with cold weather, far from it, but it was the last time I thought I might freeze to death. The end of cold weather didn't come until July 1, day 137. I was in Maine. And yes, I did say July 1. Apparently, Maine did not get the memo about summer. I ended up that day hiding from the wind and rain in a privy, eating lunch there, and then going to sleep. But I guess I should start this story at the beginning. It had rained the night before hard at times. And at 5 a.m. when I got up to get ready to go hiking, the rain had stopped almost down to a sprinkle. I had no rain gear, but maybe it wouldn't matter. The trail I hiked that morning went over 3 mountains, all above the tree line. One was called Saddleback, one was the Horn, and the other was Saddleback Junior. Before I got to the top of Saddleback, it had begun to rain again, softly at first and then harder. And then it began to get cold, uncomfortably cold. And the higher I climbed, the harder it rained, the harder the wind blew, and the colder it got. By the time I reached a series of balls on the top of the mountains, it was sleeting sideways. What had been a warm, wet day had turned nasty. The weather was pretty much identical to the weather I encountered 2 weeks earlier on June 15th. This is it. That's one of the Vikings.
That's windy. Woo. You know what the great part about it is, Lucky? I got you crossing that whole thing on videotape so you can send it home to all the non-believers.
That film was made on June 15th near Woodstock, New Jersey. And that morning, the Vikings and I took 3 hours to hike 4 miles. So we were making 1.3 miles an hour. I was so cold on the July 1 climb that I thought about leaving the trail and making a beeline for the tree line, for the nearest trees, anything to get out of the wind. But you can get lost that way. Been there, done that. When the trail finally went back down and into the tree line, I was out of the most of the wind, but I couldn't go fast enough to generate the heat I needed because the way down was just a series of ledges. I needed to find a shelter, and I needed to find it quickly to get out of my wet clothes. I knew I was close, and around every bend in the trail, I looked for it and expected to see it, but didn't. And finally, the trail turned back uphill, and I stopped. I was not going there. I was not going back to a ridge. And I just passed a privy next to the trail. They build privies next to the trail in Maine. So I turned around and went back, and I went into the privy. And I made myself at home. I was out of the wind and the rain, my little house. I stripped off my wet shirts and put on dry ones. I put on a dry insulated jacket. I took off my boots and wet socks, and I put on dry socks. I ate lunch, and then I got comfortable and went to sleep. Almost 2 hours passed before a knock on the privy door woke me. It was a woman, and she wanted to use the facility. She was a southbound hiker. It had stopped raining, and the wind died. And I said, of course, let me pack up and get out of here. And I packed up as quickly as I could to get out. And she said to me, why don't you go into the shelter? And I said, where is the shelter? And she said, about 100 yards up the trail.